It is good to be here this morning when mysterious substance has fallen from the sky yesterday. And water droplets have formed this morning, hanging in the air that we breathe. And I understand there may be more in store for us later today. So foo on those who are at ACL instead of being right here with us. It's a sign of abundance, perhaps, in the midst of the desert that has been Austin, Texas lately. I want to open today with a story of abundance and scarcity that I'm borrowing from biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, who tells the story of the people of God this way. The story of our journey as a people of God together begins with abundance. We believe in a God who loved so much that God's love spilled over outside of God's self to form the world. The Bible begins this extravagant love story by telling us that God created the universe and all within it, including us, for the sole purpose of loving us abundantly. The story continues as the people of God's affection, Adam and Eve, are loved. Life is not without its problems, but the story of abundance continues. Scarcity is not a problem for the objects of God's love throughout the narrative we're given in the text of the Bible. We're reminded over and over again how good everything is. We're told to be fruitful and multiply. There's no sign of scarcity. Abraham and Sarah are blessed by God, that they may be a blessing to all the people of all nations. This blessing of God is how creation sustains itself. Faith generates blessing, and blessing reaps bounty from the earth itself. Creation continues to spill over with the fruits of its own harvest. In fact, abundance and blessing reigns all the way through the narrative until the story of Joseph's enslavement. In chapter 47 of Genesis, we have to get to chapter 47 to find a different story. And that's where we see the first signs of scarcity that so dominate our world today. After Joseph has been taken to Egypt, the Pharaoh has a dream that a famine is coming. In the first biblical move towards market economics, Pharaoh organizes his economy around the principle that there is not enough. For the first time in the story of creation, someone tries to take control of everything in order to control the distribution of all. Martin Niemöller, the German pastor who heroically opposed Adolf Hitler, was a young man when, as part of a delegation of leaders of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, met with Hitler in 1933. Niemöller stood at the back of the room and looked and listened. He didn't say anything. But when he went home, his wife asked him what he'd learned that day. And Niemöller replied, "I discovered that Herr Hitler is a terribly frightened man." Because Pharaoh, like Hitler after him, is afraid that there aren't enough good things to go around. He must try to have them all. Because he's fearful. He's ruthless. Pharaoh hires Joseph to manage the monopoly. When the crops fail and the peasants run out of food, they come to Joseph. And on behalf of Pharaoh, Joseph says, "What's your collateral? What do you have for me?" They give up their land for food, and then the next year they give up their cattle. And by the third year of the famine, they have nothing left to give but themselves. And in this transaction, where they trade themselves for food, the people of Israel become slaves. Through an economic transaction, the people of Israel enter their slavery to the Pharaoh. And so we too no longer have abundance as a central focus of our lives. Our movies, our commercials, and the resulting tapes that are instilled in our heads, at least for me, aren't filled with messages of, "It's okay, there's enough," or "You're just fine the way you are," or "Wow, you're doing great." If your life is anything like mine, the messages that permeate your life are more like, "Your life will never be good enough until you join 24-hour fitness, get a personal trainer, and look like a Greek god." Or, "You might think you're doing fine, but you're really playing football like Betty White until you get a six o'clock." Or, "You don't have a big enough car, or house, or dream, or bank account, or whatever." Our Old Testament reading today records the story of the Israelites' journey many generations after their enslavement, as they fly from Egypt into freedom, and how difficult it was to trust that they were going to be provided for, how difficult it was to return to abundance, to head to a land overflowing with milk and honey when they couldn't see it yet. If only we died in slavery, where we at least had food, they said. That would have been better than being out here where we're hungry in the desert. How do we trust in the abundance of God when we can't see it, when we feel it will never come? How do I know there's enough when I can't see it yet? How do I know it will be okay when it doesn't feel okay? You know, I'm a CPA, little known fact about me. Went to grad school for my MBA. But in preparing today, I thought it might be worth Googling the word scarcity, just to see what came up, review my supply and demand basis. To see why we're so scared to journey into the wilderness to find abundance again, the way the Israelites did. I found this really kind of neat little video that introduced the concept of scarcity in an economic way, supply and demand. And the author began by saying that all humans have unlimited wants. I thought that was a pretty bold statement, and I wondered if she'd ever read the baptismal covenant. But she went on, of course, to say that in a world of unlimited wants with limited resources, there's scarcity of goods. What was fascinating to me is that she went on to acknowledge a drawback of supply and demand. The poor do not get the resources, she said. Then she said simply, "Oh well, that's capitalism." I would argue as an economist against this definition of capitalism. But as a priest, my friends, I would say that we are called as a church, as Christians, to live differently than the world around us lives. We're called to resist the tapes, and I'm not a priest, I just realized I said priest. I'm a deacon, thank you, sorry. But whoever I am, and wherever I am on my journey of faith, we are called, thank you. We're called to resist the tapes and messages that are played at us. We're called to live and to be the abundance of God, of God's love, which spilled over outside of God's self, bringing us into existence. simply brought into existence to be loved. Not to have a profit motive, not to be efficient, not to be bigger or stronger or the best. We simply exist that we might be loved and mirror that love into the broken world around us in an abundant way. Jesus calls us to that life today in the gospel lesson, telling us a parable where the kingdom of God is like this crazy boss who pays all his workers the same, no matter how hard they've worked, but just because they show up. Why do I say the boss is crazy? Because in our world, you think you get paid based on how hard you work, how good you are, some other measure of worth. But this crazy boss isn't working on worldly rules. He's working on the rules of the kingdom of God. He pays us based on our intrinsic value, our value that can't be stripped away because God imagined us into existence for the purpose of loving us and delighting in us for who we are, not what we do. This happens so often. Jesus has taken our everyday understanding of how things work and turned it upside down. I frequently use this parable in the hospital for patients who are in deep shame. Patients who experience the loss of self-worth or feel like they're not enough. This parable is Jesus' message to us that all those tapes, all those messages to us telling that we have to have more, a bigger house, a better body, be a better parent, to be a better son or daughter, to have more stuff, that all those tapes are lies. This parable says, I have called you by your name, and I made you, and I will provide for you without restriction. When my patients hear this, and they really hear it, it brings tears. In our Old Testament lessons today, I imagine a similar moment. The Israelites are fleeing into the wilderness. Hungry, they're worried, they're anxious. They're wondering if they've made a grave mistake, so much so that they begin to question whether turning back to Egypt and slavery would be better than wandering in the desert. They begin to want certitude for their future more than they want to trust in their future with God, even if that picture of certainty looks miserable. It's at least known. And the anxiety of not knowing what the future holds begins to be more unbearable for them than the misery of slavery. This is foolishness, of course, but how often in our own lives do we want to take the road to certainty instead of the unknown and mysterious fruits of faith? Then, suddenly, a quiet moment comes when they're fed with quails and this mysterious manna, something they had no idea even existed. We follow God. God provided. So it is that God cares for us. Not because we do great things, not because we're perfect, not because we work hard, not even because we're baptized, just because we are. I want to tell you a few stories about abundance, the life of the church, the way the church responds to that overwhelming love. The first is a story of a church in New Orleans. It's a story of the Church of the Annunciation. Church of the Annunciation is part of the Diocese of Western Louisiana. It was founded in 1844. It eliminated its pew tax in 1857 so that all people could worship there. And it's now a multicultural church with people of all different races and ethnic backgrounds. I imagine it to be similar to St. James in many ways. Unfortunately, Hurricane Katrina destroyed the historic buildings of the church. The limestone cross from the original building was blown off the roof and couldn't be found after the hurricane. Later, it was found intact on the flat slate roof above the church entrance. And a volunteer noted, it must have been set down there by a very gentle hand. What makes the story interesting to me is that the pastor, the governing board of the church, and the congregation decided not to rebuild the church right away. Instead, they've diverted all of their funds towards the mission of the church and are focusing on helping their neighbors in need. They state it this way: the church continues to follow what God is doing in New Orleans instead of asking God to bless the ideas of the church. Isn't that profound? Let's say that again. The church continues to follow what God is doing in New Orleans instead of asking God to bless the ideas of the church. I wonder if finding abundance, much like the Israelites on the way to the land of milk and honey, doesn't have something to do with this very idea. The idea of us following God and trusting that we will get what we need instead of asking God to give us what we want. Maybe that's where the Pray and Prosper ministries go wrong. They teach that all you need to do is ask God for what the tapes tell you that you need, and He will provide it. But of course, it doesn't work that way. The Israelites, in the height of their fear and concern for not enough food, asked to return to Egypt. If God had provided based on the tapes playing in their heads, I don't suppose that would have been very abundant at all. We so frequently don't have a big enough imagination to see what true abundance looks like when we're living in a world of scarcity. I wonder if the Church of the Annunciation doesn't have a lesson for us, that following God doesn't only provide enough for us, it spills over and provides enough for others too. In this case, it provided enough for both the parish and helped their neighbors devastated by the hurricane. The God of grace and glory surprises us with what we find when we trust, when we take a risk and venture out into a new and sacred space. The second story I want to tell you is about St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco. Sarah Miles, in her published memoir, Take This Bread, writes of her unlikely conversion to Christianity as a self-proclaimed blue state, secular, intellectual, lesbian, left-wing journalist with a strong skeptical streak. As a result of meeting the living God at a table much like this one, she began a food pantry at St. Gregory. Each week, in a church, maybe a little smaller than this one, the worship space is converted from a place that feeds spiritual food into a place that feeds temporal food. The altar's cleared, and groceries and other items are put front and center right here. All who are in need are welcome to come. Sarah quickly realized that the food pantry meant more needs than just hunger. She writes, I had to trudge in the rain through housing projects, sit on the curb wiping the runny nose of my psychotic man, take the firing pin out of a battered woman's Cummins 357 Magnum than stick the gun in a cookie tin in the trunk of my car. I had to struggle with my atheist family, my doubting friends, and the prejudices and traditions of my newfound church. I learned about the great American scandal of the politics of food, the economy of hunger, and the rules of money. I met thieves, child abusers, millionaires, day laborers, politicians, schizophrenics, gangsters, and bishops, all blown into my life through the restless power of a call to feed people, widening what I thought of as my community in ways that were exhilarating, confusing, often scary. She says of her conversion that it was unexpected and terribly inconvenient. But she also says that she was transformed. And certainly her ministry with many other volunteers of the parish has transformed others and been an oasis in the wilderness of many people's lives. Again, this least likely person followed God, and her former life of doing what was expected by a secular world as a journalist was replaced by an unexpected meeting with the divine. It was demanding. It was fulfilling. It was abundant. Final story I want to tell you about abundance is from another parish of a similar size. The parish was St. James Episcopal, Austin, Texas. In the story from a few months ago, a young woman named Linda came to our Neighbor to Neighbor program. She asked for a job. And she learned that no positions were available. One of our Neighbor to Neighbor coordinators, Diana Bell, asked her if she'd like to enter the lottery for HEB food cards, grocery. She did. She hung around. She won the lottery, was handed some HEB food cards and a bag full of groceries. Diana noticed. She returned to Founders Hall and handed her groceries to a family with many other children. Diana thought this was unusual. She approached Linda and asked a little more about her. And found out she hadn't eaten in 2 days. But God's abundance was there for Linda. A team of volunteers, teenage volunteers who was there for another ministry that day, went into action, making food for Linda in the kitchen. While another set of volunteers went into action, making sack lunches for Linda to take with her that day. And another set of volunteers went into action, preparing a list of resources for Linda to take with her. Resources for housing and for other kinds of support. God was with Linda that day, and trusting in the abundance of God's provision, Linda was well cared for. Thanks be to God for the ministry of St. James and Diana, Neighbor to Neighbor, which flowed over with an outpouring of God's love for Linda as she gave in trust and received in return. I hope and pray you will continue your generous ministry of Neighbor to Neighbor by bringing a grocery contribution to leave in the narthex each week, so that people like Diana can continue to make God's love tangible to people like Linda in this important ministry of our parish. It's abundant. I'm always amazed at the way the Spirit works. And today she's given us these amazing readings in the lectionary, just as we begin the St. James campaign. A campaign to reclaim, reconnect, and renew St. James. Some of us have talked about this campaign as a reflection point in our common life together. Time to look back on our journey over the past 70 years. 70 years. And see where we've come, and a time also to reflect on where the road is taking us, and where and who God is calling us to be. As we reflect, we've talked for the last 2 weeks with Stephen and Liz about the need for some reconciliation. So this week we are turning a little bit. We turn from looking back to looking forward to face the road ahead. We cannot and must not stop the work of reconciliation. That's the gospel imperative. But we're also called to give our lives to the church. I've asked that we include the renewal of baptismal covenant in today's service so that we can recommit to our common life together as we turn to look forward to what we want the next 70 years to look like. So as we prepare to do that, I hope it will be with a spirit of abundance in our life, labor, and liturgy. I leave you today with a story that a friend of mine told me from his visit to the Holy Land. You remember that we talked about the people of Israel as they left Egypt, bound for the land of milk and honey? Well, they knew they'd gotten there when they crossed the River Jordan, a river that's still there today. And the River Jordan flows into two lakes, or seas. The first one is the Sea of Galilee. It's a sea where Jesus did much of his ministry. If you go there today, my friend says that it's full of life. It's vibrant. There's fishing and boating and swimming and fun. There are people everywhere. The thing about the River Jordan is that it flows into and then out of the Sea of Galilee. It flows freely through that body. The River Jordan flows down next into the Dead Sea. It stops there. There's no outlet. My friend tells me is interesting is that there's no life in the sea. There are no fish. There's no boating to speak of, little entertainment, few people. We have choices in life. We can allow people, money, and things to flow through our life. When we do, our lives are filled with abundance. The Sea of Galilee. When we hold on to things, we become fearful of loss. The movement stops. Life stops. Our lives become like the Dead Sea, cold and frightening. St. James is no Dead Sea, my friends. As we turn forward from this place today, and as we begin to consider the role of St. James in our lives, both individually and collectively, my hope is that we do it with abundance. My hope is that we discern how to be even better at living with abundance and resist the messages that are always pounding at our door. My hope is that each of us pledge ourselves, not only financially, but that we also look at how we can give all of our lives and labor to the mission of God, as God makes God's abundance tangible. How we become a rich outpouring of love that flows freely through this place until the music is so loud that they can hear it all the way down the street and people can't help but come in. And the peace is so outrageous it invites strangers in from the outside. And the ministries are so effective that people peer in the windows wondering what in the world is going on in this place, until we see them and welcome them in warmly to be a part of what we've got going on in here. And St. James will be a bright beacon of hope that abundance is possible in a world that says it isn't so. Thanks be to God.
Amen.